Between 1929 and 1939, American families made 30 dinners from almost nothing flour mixed with water for gravy, stale bread soaked until it turned to mush, and potatoes fried with onions because meat cost too much. Half of them vanished, not because people wanted to forget, but because nobody who survived the Depression wanted to remember what it felt like to eat that way. Number 1 is a baked onion stuffed with peanut butter that tastes exactly strange. Number 7 confused anyone who saw spaghetti served that way. Number 15 uses an organ most people won't touch now. And number 21 is soup made from the water potatoes were boiled in. These dinners didn't just feed families, they kept them alive. This is number 1 from the intro baked onion stuffed with peanut butter that tastes exactly as strange as it sounds. In 1933, the Bureau of Home Economics published a pamphlet recommending this dish to families who couldn't afford meat. The idea was simple. Onions were cheap, peanut butter had protein, and if you baked them together, you had dinner. You peeled a large yellow onion, cut off the top, scooped out the center, and filled the hollow with peanut butter mixed with stale breadcrumbs. Then you wrapped it in wax paper, put it in the oven at 350 degrees, and baked it for about 45 minutes until the onion turned soft and the peanut butter melted into the layers. It came out hot, sweet from the onion, salty from the peanut butter. The smell filled the kitchen, part caramelized onion, part roasted nuts. Some families ate it plain. Some poured a little bit of the cooking liquid over the top. Nobody makes it now. The combination sounds wrong. But in 1933, when a pound of ground beef cost more than most families made in a day, it worked. It was warm, it was filling, and it kept people fed. Milcorno was invented at Cornell University in 1931 as emergency food for people who had nothing left. Scientists mixed dried milk powder with cornmeal and called it a complete meal because it had protein, carbohydrates, and enough calories to keep someone alive. Families cooked it like oatmeal. 4 parts water, 1 part Milcorno, stirred over low heat until it thickened into a paste. Some added salt. Some added a spoonful of sugar if they had it. Most ate it plain, because there was nothing else to add. It tasted like watered-down cornmeal with a chalky aftertaste from the powdered milk. The texture was gritty, thick, almost gluey. Children hated it. Adults ate it anyway because it was cheap, and it filled the stomach for hours. The government distributed Milcorno through relief programs during the worst years of the Depression. Soup kitchens served it. Churches handed out bags of it. Families who'd never taken charity before stood in line for it because their kids were hungry. By 1940, when the economy started recovering, Milcorno disappeared. Nobody wanted to eat it once they had other options. It reminded people of the hardest years, and they left it behind without looking back.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Mulligan stew started in hobo camps during the Depression. Men who rode the rails and slept in shanty towns would gather around a fire at night, and everyone threw in whatever they had: a potato, a carrot, a can of beans, a handful of rice. Whatever went into the pot became dinner. There was no recipe. You boiled water in a big pot, added everything people contributed, and let it cook until the vegetables were soft. Sometimes there was meat, a chicken bone with scraps still on it, a piece of salt pork, canned corned beef. Most times there wasn't. The stew was thin, more broth than solid food. But it was hot, and after a day of walking or looking for work, hot food mattered. Families in cities made their own version at home, using leftovers and whatever vegetables they could afford. Mulligan stew didn't have a taste you could describe. It tasted like whatever went into it that day, sometimes salty, sometimes bland, always different. but it kept people fed when there was nothing else, and that's why people made it every night for years. When families couldn't afford meat for meatloaf, they made anything loaves instead. The name said it all: whatever you had in the kitchen went into the pan. Stale bread torn into pieces, leftover cooked vegetables, a handful of raisins or chopped nuts if someone had them, maybe an egg to hold it together, maybe just water and flour paste. Everything got mashed up, pressed into a loaf pan, and baked at 350 degrees for about an hour. The loaf came out dense and dry, sliceable but crumbly. Some families ate it hot with a little bit of gravy poured over the top. Some ate it cold the next day, sliced thin and served with mustard. It didn't taste like meatloaf. It didn't taste like anything familiar. The flavor changed depending on what went in, sometimes sweet from raisins, sometimes bitter from overcooked vegetables, sometimes just bland. Nobody called it good, but it was food, and you could make it from scraps that would have been thrown away otherwise. During the Depression, throwing away food wasn't an option. Everything got used, everything became dinner, and anything loaves were proof of that. When bread went stale and nobody could chew it anymore, families didn't throw it away. They cooked it. The bread got cut into thick slices and laid flat in a bowl. Then someone poured boiling water over the slices until they were completely submerged. The bread soaked for a few minutes, softening into a soggy, falling apart mass. After the water drained off, a little bit of oil and salt got stirred in. That was the meal. It looked like wet mush. The texture was soft, almost paste-like, with no bite left. The taste was just bread bland, slightly sour if the loaf had been sitting too long, salty from whatever got added. Some families ate it for breakfast. Some ate it for dinner. Children especially hated it because there was nothing to chew, nothing to make it interesting. But adults ate it without complaint because stale bread was still bread, and bread was still food. Cooked bread disappeared after the Depression ended. People wanted to forget they'd ever eaten something that looked like that. But for years, it was a regular meal in kitchens across the country. 25 to go. The next 5 include something fried from a box of crackers, spaghetti served a way nobody expected, meat suspended in gelatin like it belonged there, fake fish made from potatoes, and cornmeal sliced and fried for dinner. These weren't recipes. They were survival. Cracker fritters came from Appalachia, where families stretched a box of saltines into a full meal. The crackers got soaked in water until they fell apart, then squeezed out and mixed with a little bit of flour to hold them together. The mixture got shaped into small patties and fried in whatever grease was left in the pan lard, bacon fat, vegetable oil if anyone had it. The fritters came out crispy on the outside, soft and doughy in the middle. They tasted salty from the crackers, greasy from the frying, and vaguely bread-like. Some families ate them plain, some poured maple syrup or sugar over the top to make them sweeter. It wasn't much. A box of saltines cost 10 cents and could make enough fritters to feed a family of 6. That's why people made them, not because they tasted good, but because they were cheap and filling. Cracker fritters stayed regional. They didn't spread beyond the rural South and Appalachian Mountains. When people moved to cities or the economy got better, they stopped making them. Nobody missed them. But for years, they were dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. This is number 7 from the intro spaghetti, served a way nobody expected. During the Depression, spaghetti got boiled for 25 minutes until it was soft and mushy. Then it was drained and set aside. Carrots got boiled in the same pot until they were falling apart. While that cooked, someone made white sauce butter, flour, and milk stirred together over low heat until it thickened. The spaghetti and carrots got mixed together, and the white sauce poured over the top. That was dinner. It tasted bland. The spaghetti had no bite left after 25 minutes of boiling. The carrots were soft and sweet. The white sauce was creamy but flavorless unless someone added salt. The whole dish was pale white sauce, yellow carrots, off-white pasta. Culinary historians call it survival food. The point wasn't flavor. The point was nutrition. Carrots had vitamins. Pasta had carbohydrates. Milk had protein. Together it was a meal that kept people alive. Nobody makes it now. Spaghetti gets paired with tomato sauce, not white sauce and carrots. But during the Depression, tomato sauce cost money. White sauce was cheaper, and cheap was all that mattered. In the 1930s, Knox Gelatin published recipes for dishes that nobody would make today. One of them was gelatin meatloaf ground beef mixed with unflavored gelatin, pressed into a loaf pan, and chilled until it set solid. The recipe called for 1 pound of ground beef, 1 packet of gelatin dissolved in warm water, salt, pepper, and a little bit of onion if you had it. Everything got mixed together and packed tightly into a pan. After it chilled for a few hours, the loaf came out firm, sliceable, cold. It looked like regular meatloaf but shinier, with a gelatin coating on the outside. The texture was wrong soft and slightly jiggly instead of firm and crumbly. The taste was just cold ground beef, salty and bland. Families ate it because gelatin was cheap and it made a small amount of meat stretch further. 1 pound of beef could feed 6 people if you added enough gelatin. By 1940, gelatin meatloaf had disappeared from cookbooks. People wanted to forget they'd ever eaten meat that wiggled. Mockfish was mashed potatoes shaped into the form of a fish fillet, coated in breadcrumbs and fried until the outside turned golden. The idea came from home economics teachers who wanted to give families a way to serve something that looked like fish when they couldn't afford real fish. The potatoes got mashed with a little bit of salt, sometimes a spoonful of flour to help them hold together. Then they were shaped by hand into flat oval patties that looked vaguely fish-like. Stale bread got crushed into crumbs, and the patties were rolled in the crumbs before frying. The outside was crispy. The inside was just mashed potatoes, soft, starchy, bland. It didn't taste like fish. It didn't taste like anything except fried potatoes. But the shape made it feel like a meal, and that mattered when there was nothing else on the plate. Some families served it with lemon juice or a little bit of vinegar to make it taste more like fish. It didn't work. But people ate it anyway because it was food, and food was what kept them going. Mockfish disappeared once real fish became affordable again. Cornmeal mush was breakfast in most Depression-era homes, but when there was nothing else, it became dinner too. The mush got cooked thick cornmeal and water stirred over heat until it turned into a solid mass. Then it was poured into a loaf pan and left to cool overnight. By morning, the mush had hardened into a sliceable block. You could cut it into thick slices, fry them in a little bit of oil or lard, and serve them hot. The outside turned crispy and golden. The inside stayed soft and dense. It tasted like fried cornbread without the sweetness. Just corn, salt, and whatever fat it was fried in. Some families ate it with a spoonful of gravy. Some ate it plain. Cornmeal mush cakes were cheap. A bag of cornmeal cost almost nothing and lasted weeks. You could make mush every day and never run out. That's why it showed up at dinner tables across the country during the worst years. When the Depression ended, people stopped making it. But for 10 years, it was one of the most common meals in America. Bread and milk casserole used up stale bread that nobody could chew anymore. The bread got torn into chunks and layered in a baking dish. Then eggs, if there were any, got beaten with milk and poured over the bread until every piece was soaked through. A little bit of salt went in, sometimes a spoonful of sugar. The dish went into the oven at 350 degrees and baked for about 40 minutes until the top turned golden and the inside set like custard. It came out soft, warm, slightly sweet if sugar had been added. The texture was somewhere between bread pudding and scrambled eggs, wet but solid, custardy but bread-like. The taste was mild, just milk, eggs, and bread. Some families ate it for dinner. Some ate it for breakfast. It didn't matter. It was a meal that cost almost nothing and used ingredients people already had. A loaf of stale bread that would have been thrown away became food for 6 people. Children didn't love it. It looked strange, too wet to be bread, too bread-like to be pudding. But adults ate it without complaint because it was filling and warm and kept everyone fed until the next day. Bread and milk casserole disappeared after the Depression ended. People wanted fresh bread, not stale bread baked in milk. But during the 1930s, it showed up on tables across the country several times a week. Waste wasn't an option. Everything got used. Tomato gravy wasn't red sauce. It was canned tomatoes cooked down with flour and water until it thickened into something that could be poured over food. The tomatoes got opened and dumped into a pot. A spoonful of flour got mixed with cold water until it was smooth, then stirred into the tomatoes. The whole thing cooked on low heat, stirred constantly until it turned thick and gravy-like. Salt and pepper went in if anyone had them. Potatoes got boiled in a separate pot, peeled, cut into chunks, cooked until soft. When they were done, they got drained and put on plates. The tomato gravy poured over the top. That was dinner. The potatoes were bland and starchy. The gravy was tangy from the tomatoes, slightly thick from the flour. Together, they made a meal that filled the stomach and didn't cost much. A can of tomatoes was 15 cents. A bag of potatoes was a quarter. That fed a family for 2 days. It wasn't fancy. The gravy was thin and watery compared to real gravy made from meat drippings. The potatoes didn't have butter or salt unless the family could afford it. But it was hot, and hot food mattered when people were cold and hungry. Tomato gravy disappeared when people started buying jarred spaghetti sauce and making different kinds of meals. But during the Depression, it was one of the most common dinners in rural America. Water gravy was what you made when there was no milk, no meat drippings, and no butter. Just flour, water, and salt. The process was simple. You heated a dry skillet, added a spoonful of flour, and stirred it around until it turned slightly brown. Then you poured in cold water slowly, stirring constantly so it didn't clump. The mixture thickened as it cooked. Salt went in at the end. That was the gravy. It looked like regular gravy, thick, beige, pourable, but the taste was flat. No richness, no fat. Just flour and water with a little bit of salt. It coated the tongue and left a pasty feeling in the mouth. Families poured it over biscuits if they had biscuits. If they didn't, they poured it over bread. The bread soaked up the gravy and turned soft and wet. You ate it with a fork because it fell apart if you tried to pick it up. Water gravy showed up in Appalachia, the rural South, and parts of the Midwest where people had nothing left. It was survival food. Nobody made it because it tasted good. They made it because flour and water were all they had, and pouring something over bread made it feel like a meal instead of just bread. By 1940, water gravy had disappeared. People who'd eaten it during the Depression never talked about it again. Sardine noodles used canned sardines, one of the cheapest sources of protein during the Depression. A can of sardines cost 10 cents and had enough fish to feed 4 people if you stretched it with pasta. The noodles got boiled in salted water until they were soft. While they cooked, the sardines came out of the can small, oily, packed tight. Some people drained the oil. Some people kept it and used it as sauce. The sardines got broken apart with a fork into small pieces. When the noodles were done, they got drained and put back in the pot. The sardines went in. Everything got stirred together. That was dinner. The sardines were salty and fishy. The oil from the can coated the noodles and made them slippery. The taste was too strong for most kids, but adults ate it because it was protein, and protein was expensive. Some families added a little bit of vinegar or lemon juice to cut through the oiliness. Some added chopped onion if they had it. Most ate it plain because there was nothing else to add. Sardine noodles stayed common through the entire Depression. Canned sardines didn't spoil, didn't need refrigeration, and could be stored for months. That made them reliable when fresh fish was impossible to afford. After the war, when people had money again, sardine noodles disappeared. Nobody wanted to eat canned fish if they didn't have to. This is number 15 from the intro, uses an organ most people won't touch now. Beef tongue was one of the cheapest cuts of meat during the Depression, because nobody wanted it. Butchers sold it for pennies per pound. Families who couldn't afford regular beef bought tongue instead. The tongue came whole, still covered in its rough outer skin. It had to be scrubbed, then boiled in a big pot of water for 3 or 4 hours until the skin loosened. After it cooled enough to handle, the skin peeled off in thick strips. What was left underneath was smooth, grayish-pink meat. The meat got sliced and put back into the pot with water, potatoes, carrots, onions, whatever vegetables the family had. Everything simmered together for another hour until the vegetables were soft and the broth thickened slightly. The tongue tasted like beef, but softer, almost creamy in texture. It wasn't tough or chewy like other cheap cuts. The stew was hearty, filling, salty from the broth, but the appearance made people uncomfortable. Even after it was cooked and sliced, you could tell it had been a tongue. Children refused to eat it. Adults ate it anyway because it was meat, and meat was rare. A beef tongue could make enough stew to feed a family for 2 days. After the Depression ended, beef tongue disappeared from most American kitchens. People didn't want to eat organ meat anymore. But during the 1930s, it kept families alive. 15 down, halfway there. The next 5 include fried liver nobody admits they miss, meat suspended in lemon-flavored gelatin, leftover scraps reheated into dinner, beef stewed with dried fruit, and rice drowned in watery gravy. These meals didn't taste good, but they kept people alive when nothing else would. Beef liver was cheaper than any other meat during the Depression. A pound cost 15 cents when ground beef was 40. That's why families bought it, even though most people hated the taste. The liver came in dark red slabs, slippery and dense. It had to be soaked in milk for an hour to take out some of the bitterness. After soaking, it got patted dry, coated in flour mixed with salt and pepper, and fried in whatever fat was available: lard, bacon grease, oil. Onions got sliced thin and fried in the same pan until they turned soft and brown. The liver cooked fast, 2 or 3 minutes on each side. If you cooked it longer, it turned tough and rubbery. The liver tasted like iron. Rich, dense, metallic, the onions helped. They were sweet and soft and cut through the heaviness of the meat. But even with onions, liver was hard to eat. The texture was smooth and almost creamy, and the flavor was so strong it lingered in your mouth long after the meal ended. Children gagged on it. Adults forced it down because it was protein, and protein was expensive. A pound of liver could feed a family of 6. That made it worth eating even when nobody wanted it. Fried liver and onions stayed on tables through the entire Depression. After the war, people stopped buying it. Liver reminded them of being poor, and they wanted to forget. Gelatin companies published recipes during the Depression to convince families that gelatin could stretch expensive ingredients. One of the strangest was corned beef suspended in lemon-flavored gelatin. The recipe called for 1 can of corned beef, 1 packet of lemon gelatin, and hot water. The gelatin got dissolved in boiling water, then left to cool until it started to thicken. The corned beef came out of the can in a solid block pink, salty, packed tight. It got broken apart with a fork into small chunks. When the gelatin was thick but not set, the beef got stirred in. The whole thing went into a mold and chilled overnight. The next day, it came out firm and sliceable. The gelatin was pale yellow and translucent. The chunks of corned beef floated inside, visible through the gelatin. It looked strange meat inside something that jiggled. The taste was worse. The lemon gelatin was sweet and tangy. The corned beef was salty and fatty. Together, they didn't make sense. Sweet and salty in the same bite, soft gelatin and chewy meat, cold and slippery all at once. Families ate it because 1 can of corned beef cost 30 cents and could be stretched to feed 8 people if you added enough gelatin. That was the point. Not flavor, just stretching food as far as it could go. By 1940, recipes like this had disappeared from magazines. Nobody wanted to eat meat in sweet gelatin ever again. The leftover plate wasn't a recipe. It was whatever remained from the last 3 or 4 meals, reheated and served together. A spoonful of mashed potatoes from 2 days ago, a piece of bread that had gone stale, half a boiled carrot, a few spoonfuls of beans, a slice of meatloaf if there'd been meatloaf that week. Everything went onto a plate, got covered with a lid or another plate, and set on top of a pot of boiling water to steam until it was warm. The food didn't match. Potatoes next to beans next to bread. Everything had been cooked separately, eaten separately, and now it was together. The flavors didn't blend. Each bite tasted like something different, salty, bland, sweet, sour, all on the same plate. But it was food, and nothing got thrown away. Families kept a bowl in the icebox where every leftover went. When the bowl was full, someone made a leftover plate. That was dinner. Children hated it. They wanted meals that made sense: meat with potatoes, soup with bread, not a pile of random food that didn't belong together. Adults ate it without complaint because wasting food wasn't an option. Every scrap mattered. The leftover plate disappeared after the Depression ended. Refrigerators got bigger. People threw food away. But during the 1930s, nothing was wasted. Everything that could be eaten was eaten, even if it meant reheating 3-day-old carrots and calling it dinner. Prune and beef stew combined 2 cheap ingredients: dried prunes and the toughest, cheapest cuts of beef. The beef came in chunks so tough they couldn't be chewed unless they were cooked for hours. The prunes came dried, wrinkled, packed in bags that cost almost nothing. The beef went into a pot with water, salt, and whatever vegetables were available: onions, carrots, potatoes. It simmered on low heat for 3 or 4 hours until the meat turned tender enough to fall apart. An hour before serving, the prunes went in. They softened in the broth, turned plump, released their sweetness into the stew. The stew came out dark and thick. The beef was soft and salty. The prunes were sweet and slightly tangy. The broth tasted like a mix of both savory and sweet at the same time. Prunes were one of the few fruits families could afford during the Depression. Fresh fruit spoiled too fast and cost too much. Dried prunes lasted for months and added flavor to dishes that would have been bland otherwise. Prune and beef stew stayed regional, more common in the Midwest and parts of the South where prunes were easier to get. After the Depression, people stopped making it. The combination of sweet and savory felt old-fashioned, and nobody wanted to eat like their grandparents had. Rice and flour gravy was one of the simplest Depression meals. Rice got boiled in salted water until it was soft. While it cooked, flour gravy got made flour browned in a dry pan, then water added slowly until it thickened. Salt went in. That was all. The rice went on the plate. The gravy poured over the top. That was dinner. The rice was bland and starchy. The gravy was thin and tasteless, just flour and water, nothing else. Together, they filled the stomach but didn't give much flavor. Some families added a spoonful of lard or bacon grease to the gravy to make it richer. Most didn't have anything to add. Rice was cheap. A bag of rice cost a quarter and lasted weeks. Flour was even cheaper. Together, they made a meal that cost almost nothing and could feed a family of 6. Children complained that it tasted like nothing. Adults ate it in silence because complaining didn't change what was on the table. There was no meat, no vegetables, no butter, just rice and gravy night after night until there was money for something else. Rice and flour gravy disappeared after the Depression ended. People who'd eaten it during the 1930s never made it again. It reminded them of being poor, of having nothing, of eating bland food just to survive. And once they didn't have to eat it anymore, they never did. 20 down, 10 to go. The final 10 include soup made from potato cooking water, onions fried into cakes, oatmeal served for dinner instead of breakfast, hash made from whatever was left, and gravy made from nothing but flour and water poured over bread. These weren't meals. They were what kept people breathing. This is number 21 from the intro soup made from the water potatoes were boiled in. When families boiled potatoes for dinner, they saved the water. The water wasn't clear anymore, it was cloudy and white, thick with starch that had leached out of the potatoes during cooking. That starchy water became soup. The potato water got poured back into the pot and set on the stove to heat. A few chunks of leftover boiled potato went in the pieces that had broken apart or were too small to serve. Sometimes an onion got chopped and added. Sometimes a spoonful of flour got mixed in to make the soup thicker. Salt and pepper, if anyone had them. That was the whole recipe. The soup was thin and pale, almost translucent. It tasted like potatoes, but watered down starchy. Slightly earthy, bland, the potato chunks floated in the broth, soft and falling apart. There was no richness, no fat, no depth of flavor. Just potato-flavored water with a few pieces of potato in it. Families ate it because throwing away potato water felt like throwing away food. The water had nutrients in it, vitamins that had cooked out of the potatoes, starch that could fill the stomach. Wasting it wasn't an option. Children hated potato water soup. It looked like dishwater. It tasted like almost nothing. But parents served it anyway, and everyone ate it, because there was nothing else. On good days, there was bread to dip in it. On bad days, the soup was the only thing on the table. Potato water soup showed up in immigrant communities, Irish, German, Polish families who'd grown up eating potatoes and knew how to stretch them as far as possible. It showed up in rural areas where people grew their own potatoes and couldn't afford to waste a single one. It showed up in cities where families bought a 10-pound bag of potatoes and made it last 2 weeks. By 1940, when the economy started improving, potato water soup disappeared. People wanted real soup, with meat, with vegetables, with flavor. Soup that didn't remind them of being so poor they had to eat the water food was cooked in. Nobody talks about potato water soup now. It's not in cookbooks. It's not on cooking shows. It's one of those meals that people who survived the Depression took to their graves, never mentioning it because it reminded them of the hardest years of their lives. But for a decade, it was dinner, and it kept people alive. Fried onion cakes used the cheapest vegetable available during the Depression: onions. A 5-pound bag cost 15 cents and lasted a week. When there was nothing else, onions became dinner. The onions got peeled and chopped fine, then mixed with flour, water, salt, and a little bit of baking powder if anyone had it. The mixture was thick, more like batter than dough. Spoonfuls got dropped into a hot skillet with a little bit of oil or lard, then pressed flat with the back of the spoon. They fried for about 3 minutes on each side until the edges turned crispy and brown. The cakes came out flat and golden, crispy on the outside, soft in the middle. The onions had cooked down and turned sweet. The flour held everything together. They tasted like fried onions with a bread like coating, savory, slightly sweet, greasy from the frying. Some families ate them plain. Some dipped them in vinegar or sprinkled a little bit of sugar on top. Most ate them with nothing because there was nothing else to add. Fried onion cakes were filling. The flour and onions sat heavy in the stomach. 1 or 2 cakes could keep someone full for hours. That's why families made them, not because they were delicious, but because they were cheap and they worked. The cakes stayed regional. They showed up in Pennsylvania, parts of Ohio, Appalachia, places where German and Eastern European immigrants had settled and brought recipes that used onions and flour. They didn't spread beyond those areas. Children didn't love fried onion cakes. The smell of cooking onions filled the house and lingered for hours. The taste was too onion-forward, too strong. But adults ate them without complaint because onions were available and affordable, and feeding the family mattered more than whether anyone liked what they were eating. By the mid-1940s, fried onion cakes had mostly disappeared. People stopped making them once they could afford meat, vegetables, other kinds of food. The cakes reminded them of hard times of standing at the stove frying onions because there was nothing else, of eating the same meal 3 nights in a row because a bag of onions was all they had. Nobody makes fried onion cakes now. The recipe didn't get written down in cookbooks. It didn't get passed to the next generation. It stayed with the people who'd lived through the Depression, and when they died, it died with them. But for years, it was dinner. Plain, simple, onion-heavy dinner that kept people fed. Oatmeal wasn't just for breakfast during the Depression. When there was nothing else, it became dinner. Savory oatmeal got cooked differently than the sweet kind. Instead of water, it was cooked in broth, if anyone had broth. If not, it was cooked in salted water. The oats simmered until they were thick and creamy. Then vegetables got stirred in chopped onion, diced carrot, a handful of peas if there were any. Sometimes a spoonful of leftover meat went in. Sometimes an egg got cracked on top and stirred through while it cooked. The oatmeal came out thick and porridge-like, but savory instead of sweet. It tasted like oats, earthy, slightly nutty, mixed with whatever had been added. If there was broth, it tasted richer. If there was just salt water, it tasted bland. The texture was the hardest part. Oatmeal for dinner felt wrong. It was soft and mushy, the kind of texture people associated with breakfast, not a meal at the end of the day. But it was hot and filling, and on cold nights when there was no money for meat or potatoes, it worked. Families in rural areas made savory oatmeal more often than city families. They grew oats, or they could buy a bag of oats cheap and make it last for weeks. 1 cup of dry oats cooked up into enough to feed 4 people. That kind of stretching mattered when money was tight. Children resisted savory oatmeal. They wanted it sweet, with sugar or a spoonful of jam. They didn't understand why dinner looked like breakfast and tasted like vegetables. Adults didn't explain. They just served it and expected everyone to eat because there was nothing else on the table. Savory oatmeal disappeared after the Depression ended. People wanted oats to stay at breakfast where they belonged. Dinner was supposed to be meat and potatoes, bread and vegetables, something that felt like a real meal. Oatmeal, even savory oatmeal, reminded them of being poor, of not having enough, of making do with whatever was cheapest. Nobody makes it now. Oatmeal stays sweet, and stays at breakfast. But during the 1930s, it was dinner for thousands of families. It was warm, it was cheap, it filled the stomach, and when you had nothing else, that was enough. Not good, just enough. And enough was all anyone could ask for. Leftover hash was what you made when the week was almost over and there were scraps of food left but not enough of any one thing to make a meal. Everything went into the skillet together. Potatoes from 2 days ago cut into cubes, a spoonful of cooked carrots, half an onion, chopped, a few pieces of meat if there'd been meat that week, usually just scraps, bits too small to serve on their own. Everything went into a hot skillet with a little bit of grease lard, bacon fat, oil, whatever was available. The hash cooked over medium heat, stirred occasionally until the potatoes browned and everything warmed through. The hash came out crispy on the bottom, soft on top, mixed together so you couldn't tell where one ingredient ended and another began. It tasted like everything and nothing salty from the meat, earthy from the potatoes, slightly sweet from the carrots. The flavors didn't blend. They just existed next to each other on the same plate. Leftover hash was survival food. You made it when there wasn't enough of anything to make a proper meal. A quarter cup of potatoes here, a spoonful of vegetables there, a scrap of meat that wasn't enough to feed anyone on its own. All of it got fried together and divided among whoever was at the table. Some families made leftover hash once a week. Some made it every few days. It depended on how much food there was and how far it needed to stretch. A family of 6 could eat off a skillet of hash made from scraps that individually wouldn't have fed 2 people. Children didn't like leftover hash because it never tasted the same twice. One week it was mostly potatoes. The next week it was mostly carrots and onions. There was no consistency, no way to know what dinner would taste like until it was on the plate. Adults made it anyway because throwing away food wasn't an option. Every scrap mattered, every leftover had value, and when you fried them all together, you had dinner. Leftover hash stayed common through the entire Depression. It didn't have a recipe. It didn't have rules. It was just whatever was left, cooked together, eaten without complaint. After the war, people stopped making it. They wanted real meals, planned meals, meals that made sense. But for 10 years, leftover hash was dinner, and it kept families fed. Plain flour gravy wasn't made from meat drippings or milk. It was made from flour, water, and salt. That was all. The process was simple. You heated a dry skillet until it was hot, then added a few spoonfuls of flour. The flour toasted in the dry pan, stirred constantly until it turned light brown and smelled nutty. Then water got added slowly, stirred in until the flour dissolved and the mixture thickened. Salt went in at the end. The gravy cooked for a few more minutes until it was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. It looked like regular gravy, beige, thick, pourable, but the taste was flat. There was no richness from fat, no depth from meat, no creaminess from milk. Just toasted flour and salted water. It coated the tongue and left a chalky, pasty feeling in the mouth. The gravy got poured over slices of bread, white bread usually, because that's what was cheapest. The bread soaked it up and turned soft and wet. You ate it with a fork because it fell apart if you tried to pick it up. Each bite was bread saturated with gravy, heavy and dense and filling but not satisfying. Plain flour gravy on bread was what families ate when there was absolutely nothing else. No meat, no vegetables, no butter or milk or eggs, just a bag of flour and a loaf of bread, and you had to make dinner out of that. It showed up in the rural South, in Appalachia, in parts of the Midwest, where people had stopped looking for work because there was no work to find. It showed up in homes where children went to bed hungry more nights than not. And plain flour gravy was better than nothing. Nobody talked about eating it. Not during the Depression, and not after. It was one of those meals that reminded people how bad things had gotten so bad that flour and water counted as gravy, and bread soaked in flour and water counted as dinner. Plain flour gravy disappeared the moment people had money for anything else. Butter, milk, meat drippings, anything that made gravy taste like something other than toasted flour. By 1941, it was gone from most kitchens. But for years, it was there. Poured over bread, eaten in silence, keeping people alive when there was nothing left. Not good, not memorable, just enough to survive another day. And during the Depression, that's all anyone could ask for. 25 down. 5 to go. The final stretch includes meatballs with rice cooked inside, beef and potatoes mashed together and fried, a casserole made from whatever was left in the kitchen, salmon from a can turned into patties, and potato pancakes stuffed with ground beef. Almost there. Porcupine meatballs got their name from the way they looked after cooking rice stuck out of the meatballs like quills on a porcupine. The meatballs were made from ground beef mixed with uncooked rice, salt, pepper, and a little bit of chopped onion if there was any. A pound of ground beef got stretched by adding half a cup of raw rice. The mixture was shaped into small balls about the size of a golf ball and placed in a pot. Tomato sauce went over the top, usually canned tomatoes mixed with water, sometimes a can of tomato soup if anyone had it. The pot went on the stove and simmered on low heat for about an hour. The rice cooked inside the meatballs, absorbing liquid and swelling up. As it cooked, individual grains of rice pushed through the surface of the meat, sticking out like little white spikes. The meatballs came out soft and tender. The rice made them lighter, less dense than regular meatballs. The tomato sauce soaked into the meat and flavored everything. The rice inside was soft and savory, infused with beef and tomato. Porcupine meatballs stretched meat further than almost any other Depression recipe. 1 pound of ground beef, which normally fed 4 people, could feed 6 or 8 when you added rice. That made it valuable. Ground beef cost 40 cents a pound during the Depression, expensive for most families. Adding rice cut the cost per serving almost in half. Children liked porcupine meatballs more than most Depression foods because they looked interesting. The rice sticking out made them fun to look at, and the tomato sauce made them taste familiar. Adults liked them because they were filling and easy to make. Porcupine meatballs survived the Depression. Unlike most poverty foods, this one stayed in cookbooks and got passed down to the next generation. By the 1950s, it had become a regular weeknight dinner in American homes, not because people were poor, but because it was easy, and kids ate it without complaining. Today, porcupine meatballs still show up occasionally. Fewer people make them than did in the 1940s and 50s, but the recipe hasn't disappeared completely. It's one of the few Depression-era dinners that didn't vanish the moment the economy recovered. But during the 1930s, it wasn't a fun weeknight meal. It was survival food, a way to make expensive ground beef feed more people, a way to stretch $1 as far as it could go, and it worked. Meat and potato patties stretched ground beef by mixing it with mashed potatoes. The more potatoes you added, the further the meat went. The recipe was simple. Ground beef got mixed with cold mashed potatoes, usually leftovers from the night before. The ratio was about half and half, but families adjusted depending on how much meat they had. If meat was scarce, the ratio shifted to more potatoes and less meat. Salt, pepper, and a little bit of chopped onion went in if anyone had onion. Everything got mixed together by hand until it held together. The mixture got shaped into flat patties, about the size of a hamburger, but thicker. The patties were dusted with flour on both sides, then fried in a hot skillet with a little bit of oil or lard. They cooked for about 4 minutes on each side until the outside turned golden and crispy. The patties came out crispy on the outside, soft in the middle. They tasted like beef and potatoes, savory, slightly salty, filling. The potato lightened the texture and made the patties less dense than pure meat. The outside had a nice crust from the flour and frying. Meat and potato patties were cheaper than hamburgers. A pound of ground beef made 8 patties when you added enough potatoes. That same pound of beef would have made only 4 hamburgers. For families trying to feed 6 or 8 people, the math mattered. Children didn't always notice the potatoes. If the patties were fried well and seasoned right, they tasted close enough to regular meat that kids ate them without complaint. Adults knew exactly what they were eating: stretched meat, poverty food, a way to make expensive beef feed more mouths. The patties stayed popular through the entire Depression and into the war years when meat was rationed. Even after the war ended and meat became affordable again, some families kept making them because they'd gotten used to the taste. Meat and potato patties didn't disappear completely, but they became less common by the 1960s. People wanted real hamburgers, real meatballs, real meat that wasn't stretched with potatoes. The patties reminded them of hard times, and once they didn't have to eat them anymore, most people stopped. But during the Depression, they were everywhere. Fried in skillets across the country, served on plates next to whatever vegetables were available, eaten without complaint, because they were food, and food was what mattered. Not fancy, not memorable, just enough to keep people fed, and that was all they needed to be. Depression casserole didn't have a fixed recipe. It was whatever you had in the kitchen, mixed together and baked. The base was usually rice or pasta, something cheap and filling. Ground beef if there was any, but often there wasn't. Vegetables, canned or fresh, whatever was available. Carrots, peas, corn, green beans. Onions almost always, because onions were cheap. Everything got mixed together in a baking dish with water or canned tomatoes or milk if anyone had milk. Salt and pepper went in. Dish got covered with a lid or a piece of aluminum foil and baked at 350 degrees for about an hour until everything cooked through. The casserole came out hot and steaming. The rice or pasta had absorbed the liquid and turned soft. The vegetables were cooked down and tender. If there was meat, it was mixed throughout in small pieces, stretched as far as possible. The whole dish tasted like whatever had gone into it, sometimes tomato-heavy, sometimes bland, sometimes surprisingly flavorful if someone had added the right seasonings. Depression casserole was efficient. You could use up everything in the kitchen that was about to go bad: half an onion, a handful of rice, a spoonful of leftover vegetables. Nothing got wasted. Everything went into the casserole. Families ate it straight from the baking dish. There was no serving platter, no presentation, just a hot casserole on the table and everyone taking a scoop. It was filling. One casserole could feed 6 people, and the leftovers, if there were any, could be reheated the next day. Children didn't love Depression casserole because it was never the same twice. One week it had carrots and rice. The next week it had pasta and beans. There was no consistency, no favorite version to look forward to. It was just whatever was available, mixed together and baked. Salmon croquettes were made from canned salmon, one of the few affordable sources of protein during the Depression. A can of salmon cost 25 cents and could feed a family of 6 if you stretched it right. The salmon came out of the can in a solid pink block, packed with bones and skin. The bones were soft from the canning process and got mashed into the mixture. The skin got picked out and thrown away, though some families left it in. The salmon got broken apart with a fork into small pieces. Eggs went in 1 or 2 depending on how much salmon there was. Breadcrumbs or crushed crackers went in to bind everything together. Salt, pepper, a little bit of chopped onion if anyone had it. Everything got mixed by hand until it held together, then shaped into small patties about the size of a hockey puck. The patties got fried in a hot skillet with a little bit of oil, cooked for about 3 minutes on each side until the outside turned golden and crispy. The inside stayed soft and flaky, pink from the salmon. Salmon croquettes tasted fishy, not fresh fish fishy, but canned fish fishy. Salty, slightly metallic, oily, the breadcrumbs helped absorb some of the fishiness and made the texture less dense. The crispy outside gave them some textural contrast. Children didn't like salmon croquettes. The smell of cooking canned salmon filled the house and lingered for hours. The taste was too strong, too fishy, too different from the mild flavors kids preferred. But adults ate them because they were protein, and protein was expensive and hard to come by. Salmon croquettes stayed popular through the Depression and into the war years when meat was rationed. Canned salmon didn't require ration stamps, so families could buy it when they couldn't buy beef or pork. That kept it on tables even after the Depression technically ended. Stuffed potato pancakes took regular potato pancakes, already a Depression staple, and made them more filling by adding a spoonful of ground beef in the center. The potatoes got peeled and grated by hand on a box grater. The grated potato got squeezed in a clean towel to remove as much water as possible. Then it was mixed with a little bit of flour, an egg if there was one, salt and pepper. That was the potato mixture. The filling was ground beef cooked with chopped onion and salt. Not much beef, maybe a quarter pound, to make a dozen pancakes. Beef got browned in a skillet, then set aside. To make the pancakes, you took a spoonful of the potato mixture and flattened it in your hand. A small spoonful of the cooked beef went in the center. Another spoonful of potato mixture went on top, and you pressed the edges together to seal the beef inside. The whole thing got flattened into a patty about half an inch thick. The pancakes fried in a hot skillet with oil or lard for about 4 minutes on each side until the outside turned golden and crispy and the inside cooked through. You had to flip them carefully because they could fall apart if the potato mixture wasn't holding together well. The pancakes came out crispy on the outside, soft inside, with a savory beef center. The potato was bland and starchy. The beef in the middle was salty and flavorful. Together, they made a complete meal, starch and protein in one bite. Stuffed potato pancakes stretched meat further than almost anything else. A quarter pound of ground beef, which wouldn't feed anyone on its own, became the filling for a dozen pancakes that could feed a family of 6. That kind of efficiency mattered when meat cost 40 cents a pound and most families made $1 a day. 30 dinners. 10 years. All of them made from almost nothing because there was nothing left to use. Flour and water, stale bread soaked in boiling water, potatoes fried with onions because meat cost too much. These meals didn't disappear because people wanted better food. They disappeared because nobody who survived the Depression wanted to remember what it felt like to eat that way. Most of these recipes died with the people who made them. No cookbooks. No family records. Just memories that nobody wanted to pass down because they were too painful to talk about. If your grandparents lived through the Depression and never told you what they ate, this is why. It wasn't food. It was survival. If this brought back memories or taught you something you didn't know, smash that like button. Share it with someone whose grandparents lived through this. And subscribe, because history like this deserves to be remembered even when it's hard to hear.